Hello YouTube, this is Daniel McNamara with the Students of S.H.I.E.L.D. Coming at you with another favorite issues episode. And in this episode I'll be talking about Avengers number 280, titled Faithful Servant. And this is dated back to June of 1987. So I know, my previous podcast I talked about Iron Man number 182. I highly suggest going and check that out if you haven't checked it out already. It's about 25 minutes, so pretty long for one single issue. I'm probably going to do around the same amount of time today with this one, so keep that in mind. But yeah, so I figured Iron Man is clearly my favorite solo character, and with the X-Men I really have gotten to really like a lot of the Avengers stuff. I did 4 podcasts on Avengers stuff already on this channel, pretty much talking about every issue up through like number 76, I think. So if you want to check those podcasts out, they're also available. This is a little bit further on in the timeline of the Avengers. This is Avengers number 280, titled Faithful Servant, like I said. And this dates back to June of 1987, so pretty late in the Avengers run, obviously past the Stan Lee, Jack Kirby days. I believe this is during the Roger Stern run, but it's interrupted, I guess, by a Bob Harras issue, so I'll get to all that stuff. But this issue really stands out a lot. It's and I'll talk a little bit more about where this lies in the Avengers history. So just to get into some details about it real quick before I move on, just so people know, the writer in this book is Bob Harras, and Bob Hall is the artist. So you have 2 Bobs, I guess, working on it. Bob Harras is known for a few things, mostly with Marvel. He wrote the Nick Fury versus S.H.I.E.L.D. series. I actually recently got done reading that book about a month ago. Really great story. Kind of in the late 80s, I guess, kind of around the same time that he was writing this Avengers issue. I think that was like 1988 or 89, I'm not sure. But, great story about Nick Fury versus S.H.I.E.L.D. Kind of very much like the Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Story or TV show at the end of the first season, kind of that's in that same vein. I really liked his writing there. Also, he wrote a little bit of Namor, the Submariner book. I never read that, but I can only imagine. I'll probably read it sometime down the line if it's collected in something. And with Bob Hall, he wrote for a bunch of different companies. He wrote for DC, Marvel, and he also went into Valiant, which is an independent comic company. Different stuff. That was my computer, so you have to excuse that. He also wrote, and I didn't notice. I'll talk about this more as we go on. But he also He drew Marvel graphic novel number 27, which is the Emperor Doom storyline, which I'll talk a little bit about as it's kind of related to this as we go along. He also did a lot of Amazing Spider-Man stuff. He also drew the first West Coast Avengers miniseries before it got its ongoing title. And just some information about this issue. I actually found this issue for $1 at a local shop, and the shop that I go to, it has a lot of single issues. I was able to collect most of Roger Stern's run on the Avengers. I believe he wrote from like 265 to 285 or something like that, so he had a pretty lengthy run. I think it actually, if I'm not mistaken, it actually goes further past that. I think so I'll talk about it later on, but Roger Stern's run is probably one of the most famous runs in Avengers history. And you can collect this in a single issue. You can probably go to a store and find it. I mean, it's not like a marquee issue. It's not going to be like really expensive to get. Like I said before, I got it for $1, and I'm actually holding the copy right here in my hand. It's a pretty good grade copy. Nothing really beat up on the sides. A little bit of yellowing, but honestly, this is a pretty good grade issue for what it is. I mean, like I said before, no one's going out to go buy this issue, except for me, because I really thought it was a special story. So, but if you can't find it anywhere in long boxes or stuff like that, you can explore, I guess, a little bit, and I highly suggest you do. In the Judgment Day Epic Collection that Marvel has. So like I've discussed in other podcasts, like Marvel publishes Epic Collections that collect a bunch of different like Volume 1 material for their favorite characters like Captain America, Iron Man, Thor, Hulk, and the Avengers as well. And And this Epic Collection has Avengers Volume 1, number 278 to 285, Avengers Annual number 16, that Marvel graphic novel number 27, like I was discussing, the Emperor Doom story, and also has a bunch of other stuff that I think you would like X-Men versus Avengers Volume 1, number 1 to 4. That miniseries is really interesting, and I might do a separate podcast on that, but that's a really good story. It also has a West Coast Avengers Annual in it, because I think it kind of tied. I think the West Coast Avengers Annual and the Avengers Annual are like a two-part story, if I'm not mistaken. So, you know, and this issue kind of comes in at the very beginning of this Epic Collection. So, just to step back a little bit about where this takes place. So, before this issue, well, I guess maybe before I go on, I can describe the cover a little bit. And it's probably like I do with all these podcasts, I show all the panels and all the pages and stuff. For some reason, the website that I usually get the panels from, this one was, I guess it was scanned, so the pages look like shit. So you have to excuse, I guess, the quality of them. But the cover, for some reason, on that website came out perfect. So you can see here Jarvis is laying in bed, with his one eye hurt, covered up because he got hurt, damaged. And then you have the heads of all the Avengers: Iron Man, Vision, Scarlet Witch, Captain America, Thor, Janet Van Dyne, Wasp, Ant-Man, and Hawkeye. So, and the cover title has "To Serve No More," but the actual title of the issue is called "Faithful Servant." So, just sit back and talk about a little bit where this fits in the Avengers history. So, like I said before, this is probably this is like smack dab in the middle of Roger Stern's run on the Avengers, and I'm a little curious as to why he didn't write this issue. I'm guessing maybe he had some other conflict, or this was just a filler issue until they were preparing for the next story arc or whatever. Because the next story arc that follows this, I believe, is like the Olympus, like Assault on Olympus. I forget what it's called, but Zeus basically gets mad at the Avengers for Hercules getting screwed up. But anyway, but this issue directly follows, I believe, the Under Siege storyline. And for a lot of people who are Avengers fans, I highly suggest you go out and read the Under Siege storyline. There actually is an Epic Collection that comes before the Judgment Day Epic Collection that this issue is in, that has the whole Under Siege storyline as well as some other stuff beforehand. And it's a really great storyline. This era of Avengers I just really like in general because Janet Van Dyne is leading this team, and it's a pretty awkward team. I mean, you have not awkward, but it's a very, I guess, unconventional team. You have Namor, you have Black Knight, Hercules, and then you also have the mainstays like Thor and Cap. So you have a good mix of different. And then She-Hulk would join later. I think she joins like right after this issue. So a good team. Obviously, there's like people have a little controversy over like the Wasp and her relationship with Hercules and Black Knight during this era, but regardless of that, so basically, just to summarize the Under Siege storyline without spoiling anything, basically the Masters of Evil team up and destroy the Avengers Mansion, and in today's comics that just seems a little bit like cliche, like that always happens, especially with the X-Men. Their mansion always gets screwed up, but back in the 80s, I guess this was a kind of a novel concept to think of. And I remember reading a story, like an interview with Roger Stern in the Epic Collection that was talking about like this whole idea of doing a Under Siege storyline. He's like, well, what if we just took all of the Avengers villains and just put them all together and just had them overwhelm the Avengers Mansion? I mean, it made for a really good storyline, and there were some good moments. At the very end, I can remember my most memorable moment of the Under Siege storyline was Cap, going back into the wreckage of the mansion and thumbing through his like personal stuff, and he came across the only picture that he had left of his mother, and I think it was like ripped or like torn or whatever, and it was a very emotional moment. I think Captain Marvel, Monica, was there to like kind of comfort him, and that was a big defeat. And Hercules was also he also got beaten to a coma. The Wasp was leading the team with a mysterious recruit that came in at the last second, Dr. Druid, if I'm not mistaken. And during the storyline, the whole reason why I bring this up is during the storyline, Avengers Mansion is run by Jarvis when the Avengers aren't there. So The Masters of Evil came in, and one of the Masters of Evil, Mr. Hyde, actually came into the mansion and beat the shit out of Jarvis and like pummeled him almost to the brink of death. And this was like in Avengers like 275 through 276, so about 5 issues before this. So with that being said, like that's where Jarvis is at. Like he got beat to shit and he's in the hospital now recovering from a fight that the Avengers had at their mansion. So just give me 1 second. I brought back the tea like I usually do for my podcast, so I need to take a break. But yeah, so that's kind of the backstory. So the Under Siege storyline happened. The Avengers won, but at great cost. They lost their mansion, all that stuff. And so Jarvis is sitting in the hospital, trying to recover. And obviously, the first person that's going to see him is his longtime boss, who is Tony Stark. And he comes in, kind of tries to comfort Jarvis, and it's like, I'm sorry for what happened. At this time, Tony wasn't a active Avenger. He was, off doing his own stuff. I think he was actually serving as a West Coast. Yeah, he was. I'm pretty sure he was serving as a West Coast Avenger. So that's why he wasn't with the team. But he comes in and says like, I'm sorry I got you wrapped up in the Avengers. And after this initial contact with Tony, Jarvis kind of lays down rest, and he starts thinking about all the different times that all the interactions he had with all the Avengers over the years. And that's what I love about this issue, is that it's really just it's its own separate story, and that's why I like talking about. When I pick my favorite issues, I try to pick stories that people can just pick up and read without much context. Iron Man 182 was kind of like that. This is also another example of that. It kind of just gives you a brief history lesson, I guess, of the Avengers through Jarvis's eyes, and I think that's so clever because Jarvis is just an ordinary dude who has to come to work today or come to work every day, and how about the Avengers? And whatever happens to him happens, and we'll go through a little bit about it, and we'll touch on some things. But so the first flashback he has is around the time Avengers #2 happens, because obviously in Avengers #1 you had the team forming for the first time, taking down Loki. But after that, they went back to, and Avengers 2 opens up with the team in Stark Mansion, hanging out, and then the Space Phantom shows up and all that stuff. But this is before that, so Jarvis can remember welcoming all the original Avengers for like a dinner that they were having, and he remembers like making like a turkey, all this food, and like the Hulk showing up, and like he actually passed out from like seeing the Hulk because the Hulk tried to grab him and he passed out, and like he's waking up, and there's a great panel. It probably already went through, but the Wasp. He can as he's coming to, he can see the Wasp like flying around his head. He's like, "Who is that?" And then he also, kind of asked the Wasp about her affection for Thor, which was always a funny thing in the original like Avengers issues. Wasp always had like a thing for Thor and was always hitting on him, even though like Hank was like right there. And that kind of brings him full circle back to like he thinks about Jan, and he's like, oh, and then he thinks about Hank, and then we get a whole history lesson on their story, and we all know what happened there. They had their they were in love, they were teammates for a long time. Then Hank became Yellow Jacket, and then obviously they went through that whole thing with the abuse and the divorce, and her rise to leadership as an Avenger, and Hank moving out west to be with the West Coast Avengers. I mean, I don't know if I don't think that was mentioned in the issue. I'm not sure if he's done it yet, but I know like that. I know. Actually, yeah, I think he already has. I think he's with them like near the start of the original ongoing series. But kind of that whole, this whole story is kind of just weaving through all the different relationships that Jarvis has had with all the different Avengers. So that's kind of the first flashback he has. And, the whole time he's thinking like, oh, how innocent they were back then, and how different things were then than they were now. So the next big memory that he can think of is around Avengers #16, and obviously anyone who's a big Avengers fan, sorry about that noise, knows that Avengers 16 is was the marquee issue where the original team left, and a new team was created that included Quicksilver, Scarlet Witch, Hawkeye, and Captain America, the Kooky Quartet, which Jarvis actually mentions as being the Kooky Quartet in his thoughts. So I'm kind of curious as to whether or not this was the first time this was like mentioned as that. I don't know. I can't remember any time when the team actually existed that they call themselves the Kooky Quartet. Someone could probably correct me in the comments, or we can discuss it. I don't know. But yeah, he can remember seeing Giant Man, Wasp, and Iron Man leaving the Avengers, and kind of being a little scared, like I'm in a house with a bunch of villains. Like who's to say I won't get killed? When I go to sleep or something. So, and he also remembers a lot of times, like I said in my other podcast, the arguments between Hawkeye and Cap. Those two obviously really didn't get along in the beginning. Hawkeye always disobeyed orders, always gave Cap like the middle finger when it came to orders and stuff like that. So, and he also remembers Cap, confiding in Jarvis. Oh my God, all these noises. I'm sorry. He remembers confiding in Jarvis about the about Bucky and the whole how Cap had to deal with losing one of his closest friends. Jarvis even calling Cap at one point a proud, complicated man. And no words can pretty much describe him better than that. I mean, Captain America was very in his ways, but he had a lot of baggage to deal with. So as we go along here, like Jarvis you really start to feel empathetic and start to understand what Jarvis's role was in all of this during this time. And then it kind of leads into the next part, as Jarvis thinks about Cap and Hawkeye, he thinks about how Hawkeye went on to form his own team out west with the West Coast Avengers. So talking about how Hawkeye has evolved as a person. Went from a disobedient Avenger to a leader, which is remarkable. He also thinks about the Scarlet Witch and the Vision going on to have kids, twins. So a lot of different, Jarvis has seen all this happen. Throughout all this time, he has been the consistent factor that has seen all this happen. He's also heard about Quicksilver, turning into a traitor, kind of turn his back on humanity and all that stuff. And that's also, as we go, if you read this epic collection, you'll understand where that storyline is coming from. There are a few storylines in the two epic collections that I mentioned earlier that show Quicksilver kind of not trusting the Avengers, really kind of being his own person out there. And so the next kind of memory that bleeds into and this one really hits home hard with Jarvis is around Avengers number 54, which is the same time as the first appearance of Ultron, which I talked about in the podcast. Let me just take another drink real quick because I'm talking a lot. But yeah, this is another good example. And I think this one's the most important one to note is that in this issue, Ultron basically manipulated Jarvis into helping him and luring the Avengers into a fight with the Masters of Evil, because Ultron promised Jarvis that he would save his mother, who was suffering some sort of illness. And once the Avengers beat Ultron, or I think Ultron got away or whatever, it was a while where the Avengers didn't trust Jarvis. Of course he told them about what Jarvis did to him afterwards, but Janet Van Dyne didn't forgive him for a long time, and it was hard. So a lot of these stuff is kind of fueling Jarvis, because he's sitting here lying in this bed injured. He's like, do I really need to keep doing this? I've been beat up, I've been emotionally hurt, I've been physically hurt. Do I need to keep doing this? And it's all I've seen with some people is just sadness, and but I've also seen a lot of success with people, like Scarlet Witch and Vision, moving on and being together, Hawkeye having his own thing. So Jarvis is really torn at this point, and the whole time, the reason why he's having these flashbacks is he's really contemplating whether or not he wants to stay as the butler for the Avengers. He's contemplating, is it worth it? And as we go along here, he's starting to talk to himself about why it's worth it. So the next flashback kind of comes around Avengers number 58, which is, I think it's either 58 or 57. I think it's 58, where the Vision was first introduced, and he was inducted into the Avengers ranks after a really short term, like with helping them. And, uh, they show the panel. It'll be up there. I think Jarvis is in the kitchen cooking something, and then Vision just comes. You know how he does. He just appears out through the floor, and he's like, "How you doing, Jarvis?" And Jarvis is like, "What the hell? Like, you scared the shit out of me." So, and Jarvis is like, "This guy's a robot. Like, how am I gonna relate to this guy? Like, how? Like, I can't believe they like. It's like everything. Every time that Jarvis is being a new Avenger, it's always something different. So he's like, how are we gonna make this guy feel welcome in our group? He's a robot." And Jarvis came to really get to know Vision a lot because they both really like poetry, I guess. So you can see like they show a few moments where like Vision and Jarvis are talking about poetry and like which one's their favorite and all that stuff, and just to show like how Jarvis is so integral to the Avengers and their team. In the last flashback, which I personally have not read, so I was guessing around the timeline. I was looking through some issues and trying to see where this fit is around Avengers like 123. I'm assuming it's probably maybe a little bit further because this talks about the Mantis and the Swordsman, who would be I think this is around like the Celestial Madonna storyline. I think that's around the same time, 123ish. And so with all the stuff that he liked about Vision and all this stuff, he kind of sits back and talks about, well, okay, Mantis and Swordsman had this really complicated service with the Avengers. Mantis was kind of like going after Vision, and that kind of put a rift in the Vision and Scarlet Witch's relationship, and also the untimely death of Swordsman, who at this point was a villain of Hawkeye who turned into a hero, and was an Avenger for a while. So Jarvis takes all this stuff in, and he's thinking about it. He's like, like all this. He has had all this happiness with meeting all these people and being able to talk to them and get to know them, but he's also had to see a lot of sadness and a lot of death and destruction and all this stuff. So, he also talked about how much he's been a hindrance for the Avengers sometimes, like we were mentioning with Ultron, how he's gotten them into trouble. But he also remembers a time, and this is probably one of my favorite moments that he talks about, is that he talked about how this is not the first time he has contemplated resigning, or that he has resigned from service with the Avengers. For all you Iron Man fans out there who've read Demon in a Bottle, you'll know that Jarvis actually handed in his resignation with Tony and the Avengers Mansion back in, I think, around Iron Man 127. I want to say it might have been earlier than that, but I think it's 127. He resigned because Tony was being an asshole to him and all that stuff, but then Jarvis is like, well, he made me resign. I came back, and now Tony's come back as ever. Now he's just, in his Silver Centurion armor. He's kicking ass out there in LA with the West Coast Avengers. And at the end of the day, they show the panel, but Jarvis decides that amongst all the sadness and destruction and problems that the Avengers have given him, they've also made him his family. Like and he considers them their family. Like he couldn't walk away from them. So the last panel, and you'll see it. It's a splash page. Tony, Jarvis calls up. Gets off his bed, which is great. Gets off his bed, calls Tony, and is like, dude, like, I'm coming back. How could you guys survive without me, or something like that. And it just goes to show you like Jarvis's character, and it's such a great end to a story. I mean, you get it. Obviously, this is pretty much like a service just to show flashbacks, but I think it's really special because it finally gives you that chance to really see into Jarvis's mind and see how he saw the Avengers. And like I said before, Jarvis has been a consistent part of the Avengers the whole time. And he really is, like, in a way, a POV character for the Avengers. Like, the best part about the Avengers team is that they constantly get shaken up. And, in certain runs, like, especially with Roger Stern, the Wasp is kind of like a POV character. You really get to see, because she is the leader, you get to really hear, get to a lot of insight into her mind. And also, like, it's kind of, the whole run is pretty much narrated through her a lot. So you kind of get to see her stuff, but this issue is strictly dedicated towards Jarvis's point of view, and it's really interesting, especially even down to the writing with Bob Harris, like how he writes Jarvis, because Jarvis is, I guess, British. I'm not sure if I don't know if he was, scripted to be British in the original issues, as he is in like the movies and stuff. But it's just great to finally see his mannerisms and the way he saw things. And like I said before, we get to see a great summary of, with this issue, you can pretty much get caught up on a lot of important stuff in the Avengers timeline, and it just adds so much more character development for Jarvis, as well as the other characters that he interacted with. You know what I'm saying? Like, you get to see Vision's character development with him as well. You get to understand more about Captain America and his problems, and it's just a great story. It's very reflective on the title, and I would highly suggest you guys go out and read it. So, like I said before, you can get this in two ways. You can get the single issue and just read it like I have, or you can get the Epic Collection like I also have. But great issue. If you're not reading Avengers, this is definitely something you can pick up and read right away. Like I said, you don't really have to have a lot of background on it. And yeah, so that's everything. So if you like this video, guys, like, comment, subscribe in the comments below. And thank you for tuning in to one of my podcasts. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. I already said that, so I'm just going to go.